forward to the discussion on the budget request and other topics of importance. Without a doubt, the FDA does critical work that touches the lives of every American every day, and America continues to be blessed with the safest food and drug supply in the world. But as I look at the FDA's budget request, I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge the fiscal outlook facing the country. The Congressional Budget Office's most recent outlook shows that this administration has done more to increase our national debt than any other administration. The President's fairyland budget, more than 1 month late, never ever balances and has trillion-dollar deficits forever. It's truly a make-believe budget. We genuinely need to start having an honest conversation about how to rein in federal spending that is driving inflation, weakening the economy, and harming our long-range security. Unfortunately, again, the budget request put forth by the President truly hides from this reality and once again contains an expansive, unrealistic wish list. For FY 2024, FDA's request totals $7.2 billion, a significant increase. This is a $522 million increase, or 8% above the FY 23 enacted level. That $522 million increase includes $372 million in new budget authority and $150 million from new user fees. The budget authority increase alone is over 10% above FY 23. This subcommittee has made significant investments in the agency. Since 2018, the agency's budget authority has increased by 25%. I recognize there may be an argument for additional resources at the agency, as there is for almost all the federal agencies, and your marketplace that you regulate is growing ever more complex. But I also know there is room for improvement in utilizing existing resources. There remains a lingering concern over the lack of transparency related to the execution and utilization of the existing budget, particularly on the food side. There have been several occasions when questioned about resources and the agency has not been able to provide answers. This lack of transparency and accountability in resource management does not instill confidence to make additional investments on our end. I know that the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition houses the researchers and policymakers within the Office of Regulatory Affairs, is home to the inspection and compliance workforce. But I am concerned that presently they do not work together to execute their respective budgets. There has not been enough oversight and monitoring of funding increases the past couple of years. I intend to look deeper into how all existing resources are being used to ensure we maximize the efficient use of all resources, particularly as the agency undergoes structural reform of the foods program in the coming month. Now, we're all interested in learning more about how you will restructure, reform, and improve operations in the food program. I understand this could not be addressed in the budget itself, but there remains significant bipartisan interest in how the agency will remedy what many see as dysfunction that is adversely impacting the agency's ability to protect consumers while also possibly delaying or stifling innovation. Now, I know you're keenly aware of how vocal stakeholder groups have been on the restructuring proposal. And given the Politico article from Monday entitled "Lessons Have Not Been Learned, FDA Knew of Positive Tests Months Before the Latest Infant Formula Recall," I expect some stakeholders to be even louder. It seems that the FDA continues to be passive and reactive when it comes to infant formula inspection activities, when surely everyone at the agency knows infant formula is and has been in the spotlight. Additionally, other controversies swirl around the agency, disrupting public confidence in the FDA. High-profile incidents include findings of atypical collaboration between a drug manufacturer and the FDA on an Alzheimer's drug, granting EUA to experimental COVID vaccines on 6-month-olds, the inability to clear the market of illicit tobacco products, and not identifying a regulatory pathway for cannabidiol oil after 5 years and millions of dollars of investments from this subcommittee, just to name a few. Many Americans also refuse to get a COVID vaccination due to government distrust. We need to quickly remedy what is not working in the agency, institute needed reforms, and restore public confidence. As I stated last year, I believe that many of the problems facing the FDA can be solved through strong leadership and not necessarily with more money, and I stand by that statement. I'm sure all of us are eager to hear how you will continue to address recent challenges the agency has faced, and I look forward to working with you, and I appreciate you being with us for today's hearing. I'd like to remind all the members that we will abide by the 5-minute rule for questions. Now let me ask our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Bishop, for any opening remarks he may have.
Thank you very much, Chairman Harris. First, I would like to acknowledge that between the pandemic and the infant formula crisis, FDA staff have been working overtime and then some. So I thank you, Dr. Califf, for that. I expect much of our conversation today to focus on the impact of possible severe budget cuts. On that issue, Dr. Califf, you and I have talked, and I know that you're worried about the impact of a possible 22% cut, which you've heard, or reverting back to the FY22 funding level on things such as domestic and foreign inspections, your work on overdose prevention, and the critical work screening imported products for illegal and dangerous drugs. These are investments Republicans and Democrats have supported, and we have to fight to keep our food, our medicine, our medical devices safe for all American families. Unfortunately, despite the need to continue investing and conducting proper oversight over the FDA, House Republicans reported proposal to cut FY24 discretionary spending back to fiscal year 2022 levels threatens much of the progress made in recent years to protect our food and drugs. However, we also can't neglect other topics, including the reorganization of the foods program. I'd like to get an update on your implementation of our mandated resumption of unannounced foreign medical product inspections in countries such as India. I'd also like you to talk about FDA's work in finding alternatives to animal testing. And I'd like your comments on the eye drop recalls, and would note that both of the eye drop products associated with the deaths and loss of sight were manufactured overseas. And I'd like to also hear about the latest instance of contaminated infant formula, marking the fourth formula recall over Coronabacter contamination in the past year. As I've said before, citizens put their trust in FDA's regulation and their oversight. Every time we sit down for a meal, take a pill, and we deserve an FDA that's at the top of its game. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing from Dr. Califf, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. Commissioner Califf, without objection, your entire written testimony will be included in the record. I now recognize you for your statement, and then we'll proceed with questions.
Staff at FDA across the country and the world. To continuing support their work, the budget I present to you today requests a total of $7.2 billion, a 7.8% increase in funding for the FDA. This significant increase in funding will have an immediate impact on optimizing the health benefits of safe and nutritious food, reducing harm from tobacco products, and ensuring the availability of safe and effective medical products. This funding will also enable the agency to continue to leverage new and emerging technologies, improve the recruitment and support of a highly skilled workforce, and adapt to new production and business models in the industries we regulate. I want all of you to know, as well as the American people, that I, along with the leadership team at FDA, will continue to make long and short-term strategic organizational changes and investments to ensure this agency is best positioned for future public health and regulatory challenges. Since rejoining the agency just over a year ago, I've consistently heard from industry, Congress, and other stakeholders that the human foods programs needed more attention and support. I don't have to tell you that the infant formula shortage highlighted many of these issues. We've begun the exciting process of implementing a revitalized and forward-looking FDA Human Foods program, including a new model for the Office of Regulatory Affairs. We've announced a search for a Deputy Commissioner of Human Foods who will report directly to the Commissioner and will have clear authority over the organization, strategy, and resource allocation of the Human Foods Program. As we embark on these changes, I want to be clear, our food is already the safest it has ever been, and no other country has safer food. But that doesn't mean we can't improve. And while most public discussion has been about preventing food contamination, America has a critical need to improve its nutritional status and better understand and reduce the chemicals that put our food supply at risk. In addition to our focus on food, tobacco product regulation and enforcement remains one of FDA's greatest priorities to save lives. Although tobacco use is declining, and vaping is also modestly declining in youth, we'll lose almost 500,000 Americans this year, and millions of teenagers are already addicted to nicotine, with many new users each day. That's why our budget requests an additional $100 million in user fee and authority to include manufacturers and importers of all deemed products, including electronic nicotine delivery systems or vaping products, among the tobacco product classes for which FDA assesses tobacco user fees. No one anticipated that we would be inundated with almost 27 million applications for vaping products. It's time for this industry to pay its fair share as we grapple with the ongoing ravages of tobacco and nicotine addiction. The U.S. continues to lead the world in medical product innovation, but additional resources are needed to areas presenting new challenges. The ongoing opioid overdose crisis, supply chain issues leading to a host of critical product shortages, increasing needs of post-market evaluation, and opportunities for amazing progress in battling cancer and neurodegenerative disease. We also need to ensure continuity of the agency's modernization of our IT infrastructure and data processes. This isn't just making sure our computers are the latest model or the Wi-Fi works consistently. We need the ability to create systems that allow us to keep up with the complexities of the industries and products we regulate with immense consequences for the health of all Americans. This committee has provided significant support for our IT infrastructure and related essential services over the past few years, and we need your continued support to do our jobs well. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't call attention to our request for funding for pandemic preparedness. Lack of preparation for the next global threat will be a, quote, predictable surprise, unquote. I'd like to close by thanking the subcommittee again for your continued support of the agency. As the gold standard for protecting health, FDA is trusted by Americans and relied upon around the world for our work ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of our nation's medical products and food supply. Once again, thanks for inviting me to testify before you today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Califf. And before we start the questions, I want to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. DeLauro, for a brief opening statement.
Thank you very much, and I apologize. There are a lot of hearings today and trying to get to them, so it's a welcome also to you, Dr. Califf. And I want to, again, Mr. Chairman, thank you and Ranking Member Bishop for this opportunity. Dr. Califf, I deeply believe in the mission of the FDA. You have the critical role of strengthening the health and safety of American families. You protect the food we put on our tables and the medicine that keeps us healthy, which is why through the 2023 funding bill passed by this committee, we fight the opioid crisis, we address medical supply chain issues, we strengthen unannounced inspections of foreign drug manufacturers, we included funding to better respond to food outbreaks, improve the animal food inspection system, and address heavy metals in baby food. To that extent, let me applaud the FDA for rolling out its breast density notification rule just a few weeks ago, which would require providers to notify women with dense breasts of their status and the need for further screening. I know from my own personal experience with cancer that when it comes to surviving cancer, early detection is the key, which is why I proudly introduced the Find It Early Act to ensure that once women are notified that they have dense breasts, that they do not face out-of-pocket costs that may lead them to delay and forego additional screenings. But despite the successes we have helped FDA reach, deep and enduring challenges, I believe, remain at the agency. A year ago, our nation was in the midst of an infant formula crisis, a crisis that I am heartbroken to say is still ongoing. Supply is still missing from shelves, and the safety of the supply is still at risk. To address this in the short and long term, last year this committee led, and the House passed, $28 million in supplemental funding to address the crisis, but the funds were unfortunately never passed by the Senate or enacted into law. We are now seeing part of the impact of this void. This week, we learned that FDA once again knew about safety and contamination problems with a Rickett infant formula product months before it was recalled last month. When the Abbott formula was recalled, it was your first day on the job as commissioner of the FDA. But here we are a year later, left with the same issues. It would seem that FDA has not learned its lessons and is still dragging their feet when it comes to the health and safety of our babies, those we should be working hardest to protect. While the FDA needs strong and increased funding to achieve their goals, funding is not the only problem. I believe the issues at FDA are structural as well. For far too long, food has been treated as a second-class citizen. I was pleased to see that the FDA will finally be instituting a deputy commissioner for human foods. While I have long advocated for a single food safety agency within HHS, restructuring the FDA to include a person with relevant expertise solely responsible for our food supply is an important step in the right direction. But we must ensure that this, quote, empowered deputy commissioner is exactly that, fully empowered with direct oversight of the centers and offices responsible for food. We know from the resignation of the former deputy commissioner for the Office of Food Policy and Response that they were not fully empowered, and that is a problem. We do have a unique opportunity to meet the food safety needs of American children and families, and I look forward to working with you to ensure that FDA finally gets it right. Before I conclude, I just need to mention how concerned I am with reported, with some House Republican proposals to cut 2024 spending back to the 2022 level. These cuts would be detrimental, I believe, to the services Americans rely on, including the trust they put in the safety of our nation's food supply, the oversight of our medical supply chain, and the science and research on tobacco use. They would force a reduction in foreign and domestic inspections, impair the FDA lab's ability to find the cause of foodborne illnesses, and devastate the workforce. The American people depend on a strong FDA. While not a perfect agency, the FDA's programs must be fully funded to ensure the health and safety of the American people. Anything less puts people at risk. Again, my thank you to you, Commissioner Califf, and thank you very kindly, Chairman Harris and Ranking Member Bishop, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member DeLauro. We're going to start the rounds of questioning again. There'll be 5 minutes each in the first round. Welcome, Dr. Califf, again. The first topic I'm going to bring up is a little parochial to my region, which is inspection of catfish processing in the Chesapeake Bay. As you may or may not know, until a few years ago, FDA was in charge of all the seafood processing inspections. Change was made where we separated out one type of fish, catfish, and say, no, USDA has to inspect this. But we have a real problem with the blue catfish, invasive species in Chesapeake Bay, basically taking over the bay. And the solution is commercial fishing, which is too cumbersome if it remains with USDA and FDA co-inspection. FDA inspected catfish before. Do you feel pretty confident that if we restore catfish inspection in the bay back to FDA, that they can oversee a safe process that results in safe commercial availability of catfish, blue catfish?
Well, thanks, Dr. Harris. Let me first point out, for better or worse, I'm old enough and have been around the block enough. I've been an inspectee multiple times in different industries, including clinical trials, drugs, devices, biologics, and I know the pain when you get multiple inspections from different agencies. So we hope to fix this. Exactly what the solution is, I'm not entirely sure. We didn't ask for catfish to be removed, but it happened. So we're going to work closely with our USDA partners, and our staff will work with your staff to get this worked out. You know, people shouldn't have to undergo dual inspections when one can do it.
Thank you very much. One thing came to my attention recently is that FDA makes grants to support clinical trials, and I know they announced some in September of 2021 with neuroscience, neurologic drugs. I have a little bit of a concern where a regulatory agency now has kind of a financial tie to the regulated, because these clinical trials are done by people who ultimately would be regulated. is there any reason why these grants should be administered by FDA other than the statutory requirement, and not by the NIH, the research institute, the non-regulatory body? Do you see a potential
Well,
conflict of interest there?
To the best of my knowledge, what's been funded are more what I would call natural history studies or longitudinal studies to establish a disease state. And I think it's a very rare exception where the FDA ever funds a clinical trial on its own unless specified by law or someone in Congress allocating that money. We need to just work, I used to have multiple NIH grants. I did a lot of clinical trials in my career, and we need to just work closely with NIH and make sure we avoid the kind of conflict that you're alluding to.
Well, we might ask for specifics on those grants because they were reported in the press as being clinical trials, and that's why I use that term, but we'll follow up with that. Now, one thing that might affect, since I represent a fairly rural area, smaller stores and retailers, is the traceability rule. The idea that somehow we're going to have to ask all the way up and down the chain of people who handle a food to provide traceability evidence. Do you think that if that's not done carefully, we in fact could impair the ability of smaller stores or retailers to actually carry those foods because of these requirements? Are we going to pay attention to make sure that we don't burden them, or I should say overburden those smaller entities?
Yes, and as I've said before, having been on the other side of the fence, I understand this implicitly. We've always got to find that balance. We're looking 20 years down the road. I would predict almost everything is going to be digitized, no matter how small. We have some pilot programs with small companies to do this better, and there are ways it can be done. But in the interim, we got to balance the burden and the cost of being in digital form versus having the product available and the company surviving. And we always keep that in mind. There's a phrase that's, as I've spent a lot of time with constituents in the food industry, educate before you regulate. And so we want to work with these companies so they can get in shape. And it's always going to be the case in a regulated industry that large companies have an advantage unless there's a special effort made to make it possible for small companies to meet the quality criteria.
Well, I would appreciate that. Just out of curiosity, why would the FDA ask any business to maintain records for 2 years on perishable products? I mean, nowadays we're identifying, CDC identifies outbreaks pretty rapidly. If you have the traceability, it would seem you wouldn't need to retain these for 2 years.
I'd have to get back with you on the specifics, but I can tell you from some of the things that have happened this year, there are patterns that happen with companies and industries where when you see the way the pattern is evolving, it alerts you to pay special attention, and often you find things that were missed in the past that are part of that pattern. So what the right time is in a particular industry, we could have a good discussion, but I'm suspecting that's the justification. Of course, when everything's digital, it won't matter.
That's correct, and if we require it, maybe we can help those smaller entities to maintain digital records. With that, thank you, and yield to Mr. Bishop.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Dr. Califf, for being with us. I mentioned in my opening statement that I was interested in hearing about the impact of the possible Republican budget cuts. As you know, the FDA's budget includes two types of funding: budget authority provided through the annual appropriations process, and user fees, which are based on negotiated agreements and specific performance commitments from FDA to the industries that we regulate. They said that some are saying that the Republicans are proposing a reduction of 22% below the current levels, and others are saying that they want to go back to the FY22 funding levels. So I want to ask you if you would tell us if you have any concerns about the impact on the mission and the function of your agency with regard to several areas. First area is regulatory innovation and approval. Then inspections. What will the impact be for international mailing facilities and your ability to conduct surveillance, enforcement, and interdiction work? What about food safety? What about preparedness? Of course, you've been doing significant work in opioids and overdose prevention and reduction in substance use disorders. And of course, what impact would it have on your FDA operations? If you would do that for me, please, sir. Those seven
I know
areas.
you don't have many hours, so I'll just try to condense it into about a minute. The first point is that, we have budget authority and we have user fees, as you pointed out. There's a trigger in the user fees that if the budget authority drops to a certain level, the user fees also drop. Now, the user fees have an advantage in terms of budgeting because the industry is very focused on getting work for the price that they pay. And when you drop, so it's very tight. So when that drops, the result is going to be that our innovative companies are going to suffer. They won't get their products reviewed on time. That'll cost jobs. It'll cause our industries to move overseas. When it comes to inspections, I think you alluded to it, they'll drop. Our estimates with the levels that you talk about are between 20 and 35%, which means that things like interdicting opioids at the border, dealing with contaminated foods, et cetera, that's all going to fall down. And then for food safety, I think, if anything, we've proven this year, it's that the ecosystem of the food industry is complex. 600,000 entities that we're regulating. We got to have the information technology and the workforce to handle that. That's going to not be developable and sustainable if we don't have the funds to do it. So everything that you've mentioned is going to drop. There's just no way around it.
What does that mean for the health, safety, and welfare of the American people when it comes to the safety of our medicines, our medical devices, and our food?
Just to give it in two dimensions, right now we're number one in the world in innovation in medical products. I don't think anyone disputes that. The Economist last year, in the midst, even with the infant formula issues, rated America is right there with Canada and Finland as having the safest and most nutritious food in the world. And we're going to lose that, which will, in a country already seeing a decline in life expectancy.
Dr. Caleb, should American families and mothers be worried about the capacity to be able to feed their children and provide medicines to their families that are safe?
I'm a
That won't
grandfather
result in deaths and-
with a fairly large progeny of relatives around the country. I think people should be concerned, particularly those that are not in wealthy urban areas where the protection occurs due to the way commerce works, who need the protection of government for safety and nutrition, for example, and the safety of medical products.
My time is just about up, Mr. Chairman, so I'll save my other questions for another round.
Thank you very much. Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner Caleb, welcome. Thanks for being here with us. In your budget request, there's an ask for an increase for food safety and an increase for field staff. In my humble opinion, I think there also has to be a prioritization for those field staff and a collaboration between states. I was a former agency director in my home state of Washington. And I think it's essential that the FDA work closely with state agencies. So could you talk a little bit, in your estimation, about the current interaction between state agencies and the FDA and the human as well as the animal food program? And could you tell me how you see these roles changing in your proposed modernized food program? And also, what strategies do you see to reduce the variability in funding for state and local programs? And would you support a dedicated line for those state and local funding in the FDA budget?
I really appreciate you bringing that up. My career has been one of collaboration on the medical front, and I never pretended to be the total expert in food, but I've learned rapidly. I've heard from everyone concerned that our relationship with the states is not what it should be. It's not that there's no relationship. In fact, the majority of inspections on food, as you know, having been involved, are done at the state level, not the federal level. And so what we propose to do in our reorganization plan is to create a new office that will be the Office for Collaboration, essentially involving the states, the territories, the tribal territories in addition. Part of that is to stabilize the contracting that's done because many of the state inspectorates are paid from our budget. And what we, having been a contractor in clinical research, I know what it's like when you can't depend on a budget from year to year. You can't hire the best people that you want to hire. So what we really want to do is to make this a point of emphasis, to have it be a key office in the foods program with a leader whose job it is to regularize and make the contracting first rate. And there are other things in addition that we'll come to you about. The information flow right now is not what it should be. It's a shame that when a state inspector and a federal inspector can't share their confidential information, and we're going to need legal authority to make that happen. It'll increase the efficiency considerably. So I'm really looking forward to working with an integrated food safety system, which I have to say is what you all envisioned when you passed the FSMA regulations. And, you know, it's evolving, but it hasn't gotten to where it needs to be.
I look forward to working with you on that. Switching over to vapor product enforcement. My understanding is that a lot of these products that are available in our country actually are illegally imported from China. Maybe you could expound on that. The availability of these products across the country certainly is an area of huge concern for our children's health, our population's health. Could you talk about your plans to get these potentially dangerous Chinese products off the market and out of the hands of our children? And could you talk about the level of confidence that you have that the flavored disposable vapor products don't contain harmful chemicals, even drugs like fentanyl? And will you commit to publishing and maintaining a list of vape products that are legally allowed to be sold in the United States?
I know we're short on time. You raised a number of issues here that are really important, and I'll try to be brief. There are over almost 27 million vaping products were in applications. No one anticipated that. We've reviewed 99% of those now, which is a major achievement. It looked hopeless maybe a year ago when you had so many millions of products, but we figured out how to categorize them in a way that the applications that are not going to make it anyway because they don't, basically people didn't read the directions, we can deal with those. We're still left with a number to review. Enforcement turns out to be the critical issue now. And it is hard, but we are moving along. We've issued our first civil money penalties. We've filed now permanent injunctions. We're continuing with sending warning letters, over 100,000. We've documented those have an impact. But this is an industry, the way I like to say it, we're seeing supply chain issues and shortages in every industry we regulate except for tobacco and vaping. And we've talked about people have talked a lot about the Reagan-Udall Foundation report on the food side, but we also commissioned one on the tobacco side. And one of the key issues here is an upcoming summit we're going to have with the Justice Department because I think this is an all-of-government issue. There's recently been some publicity. I think it's no surprise, but of great concern to me that fentanyl may be showing up now in vaping products. I think it was just a matter of time. And so we got a lot to work on here, but we are definitely changing the CTP. We have a new director, a new science director. Not that the old people did a bad job, but it was a lot to get done, and we're now moving into this era where enforcement is going to be critical.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your response. Appreciate the indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Califf's testimony for today's hearing acknowledges the FDA's authority to regulate all tobacco products, including e-cigarettes. However, FDA has failed in this critical mandate. The agency will point to determinations that it's made on 99% of applications submitted by e-cigarette manufacturers. And while that figure is true, it's misleading. The list of thousands of applications FDA still has not reviewed includes the products that are most popular with kids, including applications from Juul and Vuse, which made up more than 40% of the market of e-cigarettes used by high schoolers in the most recent National Youth Tobacco Survey. FDA was required to complete all of these reviews in September 2021. It missed that deadline. Then in 2022, the agency admitted it would not complete these reviews until June 30th of 2023, nearly 2 years after the court-ordered deadline. Now, FDA has delayed the completion date again to December of 2023. Dr. Califf, I asked you about the delay during last year's hearing, and you blamed the agency's lack of funding. I understand and I share your position that FDA should have additional resources to complete these reviews. But prioritizing other work with the resources you have is a choice FDA is making, and it's a choice that's harming kids in our communities. Dr. Califf, I know that FDA's budget includes a request for an additional $100 million in user fees, including fees from e-cigarette manufacturers. I support that request, but we both know the challenges of passing legislation this year to give FDA that authority. Will you commit to prioritizing the health of children and completing all pre-market tobacco product application reviews by the December 31st, 2023 deadline FDA promised, even without additional user fee funding?
I appreciate your perspective, and I'm not contesting your portrayal of the two sides of the coin. We've reviewed 99% of 27 million products. That still leaves a few 100,000. And the big players
Yes.
who have the smartest, most well-paid lawyers are the ones that we're dealing with. And so we have to get these right because we're tied up in court with almost all of these people, even after we make our original decision. And I would point again to this summit coming up with the Justice Department is really critical about how we work our way through this effort. But to your primary question, will we prioritize the health of kids? The answer to that is unequivocally yes, we will.
Will you promise to prioritize the complete review by December 31st of this calendar year, even without the additional funding and user fees?
Yes, we've committed to meet that goal, which we've established after a pretty careful review of what's ahead of us.
Okay. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2022 included a provision clarifying FDA's authority to regulate synthetic nicotine products. These products cannot be marketed in the United States without an FDA authorization, and to date, 0 synthetic nicotine products have been authorized. However, even though FDA has started sending warning letters and issuing financial penalties to manufacturers and retailers illegally selling these products, many remain on the market, including brands that are popular among young people. Dr. Califf, recognizing that FDA's previous actions have not gotten these kid-friendly products off the market, what additional steps are you considering to enforce the law and to protect young people against synthetic nicotine products that are being sold illegally?
I know I sound like a broken record here, but just very quickly, when someone is on the market illegally, we have to
Yes.
document that's the case. Then we have to send a warning letter. Then we have to document whether they responded to the warning letter or not. Most do, but because there's so many, a fair number don't. Then we have to engage the Justice Department for enforcement. And there are issues as long as we're tied up in court about our ability to do that. I think this needs to be an emphasis of the entire government to figure out how to navigate this system. We want to get these off the market just as much as you. I walk by the stores right next to the FDA, as is documented, just like everybody else. But I can't just walk in and pull things off the shelf. There's a due process here that we have to streamline and make work across the government.
Dr. Califf, what I'm hearing you say is that it's hard. We understand that it's hard, sir, but we have to see this agency make this a top priority. We have a generation that we are losing the fight to tobacco. And we have existing regulations on the books that could stop it. And so I'm just asking for help here. The administration's regulatory agenda states that the prohibition of menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars will be finalized by August of 2023. These rules will save lives, particularly among Black Americans who've been targeted by predatory marketing from the tobacco industry for generations. Can you confirm that the FDA remains on track to finalize these rules by August?
Yes, and if I could just say, I think we're all on the same team here in wanting to do something about this problem, and I'm asking for help too. I don't mind that you're getting on me about this. You should. That's your job. But we're going to need some help in some of these areas to get these things off the shelves. And when it comes to menthol, something I'm very concerned about going into next year is that when these rules are finalized and people that have been are addicted, it's a fierce addiction to nicotine, who are dependent on menthol tobacco. If you just ask the question, where do they go to get help coming off of a terrible addiction? Our healthcare systems are not set up to deal with that right now.
Dr. Caleb, I asked if you were going to finalize them by August.
I said yes.
Thank you so much, sir. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hinson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Bishop, and thank you, Dr. Califf, for coming before our committee today. I appreciate you making your staff available to mine as we've worked not only to address some of our questions about the baby formula shortage, but many of our other shared priorities as well. I want to actually follow up on something Ranking Member Bishop kind of brought up in looking at the pilot program dealing with India specifically, but I'd like to focus on the challenges we face when it comes to our supply chain with manufacturing in China. Part of the FDA's role is to conduct inspections on these drug manufacturing facilities to ensure that there is compliance and also, of course, for safety reasons. But unlike domestic inspections, which are announced, foreign inspections are unannounced, especially when it comes to China. China may be even getting several weeks of notice before these inspections are happening. So in previous years, this committee has, of course, directed FDA to have that pilot program on unannounced foreign inspections in India and China. You've been working toward the conclusion of phase 1 of that pilot program. So I guess I just kind of like an update on that and where you stand on that pilot program.
Sure. Again, I've been an inspectee, and I really believe in the value of both kinds of inspections, and I also want to emphasize that the regulatory authority to look at records online throughout the course of the year is a very important part of a surveillance system, whether it's in the U.S. or anywhere else in the world, because the internet is pretty much connected, except for some issues in China. When it comes to India, we've done phase 1. We've done over 35 unannounced or announced within 24 hours inspections. We're now into phase 2, which is the regular inspection. And then we're going to do a comparison to find out what was learned. For China, we've been blocked until just the end of January, as you know, when the order was lifted to allow people into China. And so beginning about May, we're going to be doing the unannounced and other inspections in China also in full force as much as we can.
I was going to say, do you know if anyone's had their visas not approved? Are you facing any headwinds there when it comes to denials of entry?
Let me just say that in my tour of jobs, I helped start a university in China and also did a lot of work in clinical trials in China. And I'm very familiar with the issues there. We're worried about what I think you're alluding to. To this date, no one's visa has been blocked, but it's not easy to navigate. Often language is a problem. You need a translator who you can trust. As part of that, it has to be lined up to make sure you're in the right place at the right time. So a lot of logistics here that are tough, but we're going to do it.
Yeah, and I would say please keep us in the loop if you are facing any of those challenges in dealing with the Chinese Communist Party, because I think the last thing we need to see is that stonewalling happening when so much of our pharmaceutical industry is relying upon precursors or manufacturing in China. The last thing we need, again, is that blocking to address issues there. What are some of your biggest concerns in that space? I mean, what do you anticipate finding? What are some of the red flags that you are kind of looking out for in terms of safety process? Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, first of all, let me just say the supply chain issues, and as I said, in every commodity we regulate except tobacco are profound. And this goes for drugs, devices, biologics. The offshoring of American industry, I think, is a big problem. I'd also say, if you look at the infant formula problem, onshoring itself is not a total solution to the problem either. What we need is a supply chain system with resilience built into it around the world and not overly dependent on one area. And the reliance on China in particular to such a large extent is a problem because it's opaque and even if we do periodic inspections, it's not the same as a society where you have more freedom of information that's flowing. So I'm very concerned about it. I'm not arguing that onshoring everything is a solution, but I think we've really got to pay more attention to this.
Well, certainly we cannot trust the Chinese Communist Party. If we've learned anything, we have spent decades appeasing them instead of competing with them, and we hope they'll take us seriously. Are you tracking in the few moments that I have left any other challenges with the Chinese Communist Party that this committee should be aware of?
I mean, I think everyone's aware of the just issues that come from lack of access to information that's coming from China. And as one who, you know, there's a word co-opetition, as one who in the past has worked in China, you know, it's 1.6 billion people. Whether we like it or not, they're inventing and developing a lot of things on their own. So across the board of everything we do, I would love it if we had better communications, but we also have to be independent. We can't allow ourselves to be dependent on China. And that goes for all the commodities that we regulate, including food.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just first of all, let me just associate myself with the questions that the ranking member Bishop has asked with regard to the effects of cuts. If we're looking at inspections, foreign or otherwise, we would be cutting that effort. So I associate myself with him. I also might just say, with regard to looking at regulations that are due by August 23rd, and you have said yes to that, it's now with FSMA 11 years. 11 years, and FSMA has not been implemented. So something is wrong here in which to get things done. Let me move to infant formula if I can. Yesterday, FDA released a national strategy on infant formula. The strategy outlines numerous actions regarding importing of infant formula, but there's very limited action, only, if you will, enhancing technical assistance to smaller domestic infant formula manufacturers. And this is about the need for a domestic market on infant formula. Dr. Califf, have you inspected any of these foreign facilities yet?
We inspect foreign facilities in infant formula even before the recall, but so and they'll be in our regular rotation of inspections, just like all the others, which are going to be at least once a
So
year.
was the last time they were inspected since the infant formula crisis and our going offshore to deal with infant formula? Have we inspected those facilities?
The short answer, I mean, there are a number of facilities, so the short answer is yes, we've inspected, and very recently, but I'll get back to you on the exact
Okay,
dates.
please, I'm interested in, you know, before, we have not had the capability of dealing with foreign infections. It's been very spotty. But with infant formula, especially in the direction that we went, to say that we're going to take in product, which is, you and I have had many conversations about, that what has been our inspection regime, particularly since we faced a contaminated product produced by a U.S. company knowingly selling a contaminated product. It was discovered here, and yet nothing happened for a very long time. And what I would like to further find out is what you have found about the facilities that you have inspected, if we have done that. And I will just say this, it takes months for FDA to address domestic contaminated formula. How slowly will you respond when it comes to a contaminated product from a foreign company?
As you know,
Didn't we have one experience with a contaminated product coming in?
we had several, not just contaminated, but we had data issues with some others, but we've dealt with those, I think, very quickly, and we'll continue to deal with them as quickly as we possibly can.
Well, if we had a contamination product, to be very honestly, coming in, I, for one, would like to know what the contamination was, how it has been deliberated, and are they still providing us with a product that is coming in? And if so, the cleanup, because we haven't sorted out all of the cleanup efforts in the domestic industry here. Given what recently happened, the recall of Rickett infant formula. The FDA inspectors had become aware of the positive test in February, and that ultimately we didn't see the recall until November. These are serious issues of, when we know what's happening. Do we have a plan to respond to a contaminated product from a foreign company?
Yes. Our plans are very explicit now, they're stated, and whether it's foreign or domestic, just like with all other foods, the standards are the same, the inspections are the same, and we've now assembled a group of inspectors who are focused only on infant formula with a leader, and the leadership of the FDA is involved in the regular discussions more than on a weekly basis about what's going on in that entire industry ecosystem.
Well, if there is a plan, Dr. Califf, I think we would like to see that plan and what the details of that plan are. When I read the guidance sent to those overseas who were interested in coming into the infant formula market in the United States, they, in fact, and it says it right in the guidance, that we were going to deal with enforcement discretion, and therefore we were not, in fact, going to adhere to what all of the standards are. We were making exceptions to some of the standards that we have put there, which means that, and I don't know what they are, we don't know what they are, and are we giving a fast pass to foreign companies into the market? And again, where I started my question, what are we doing about just growing a domestic market and domestic options if we're putting them on a slow track with little or no support? So what are we doing to create a domestic market on infant formula and growing that rather than us having to rely on a foreign market?
We're not relying on a foreign market. Over 95% of our formula is coming from the domestic market and will continue to do so. I am pleased to say that Abbott has publicly announced that they're building a new plant, but that's going to take several years. And so, we have to use discretion when there's a shortage, whether it's in the U.S. or outside the U.S. You need experts to do that who reside within the FDA.
I understand that. I understand that very much, and I will conclude shortly. But Dr. Califf, but we also have an obligation to make sure that the standards that we are employing here are the same standards that we are applying to a foreign market, and that we ultimately have the responsibility of not relying on India or China for ingredients in our drugs, that we should not be relying on foreign markets to deal with our supply of infant formula. We need to grow a domestic market. Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Carl.
Dr. Califf, welcome.
Thanks.
It's glad, I'm so glad to have you here today, and I appreciate the job y'all do at FDA. I truly do. It touches, I've been in the pharmacy business one way or the other my entire life, and I appreciate what you do. You're not perfect by no means. Today, I'd like to talk about your proposed ruling on menthol cigarettes and flavored cigars. In that ruling, the FDA says it does not think that there could be an illegal market that could occur in the United States. I want to reflect back to Mobile, Alabama, which that's where I'm from. In the 40s, they could bring Cuban cigars in there so cheap that the local people came up with an idea that they'd put a 25-cent tax per cigar on there. And lo and behold, what they've created is a black market now. And that black market is they sell very few cigars in Mobile proper. Most of those cigars are sold on the black market in Mobile. They go across the state line into Florida to buy the cigars. So there will be a way that criminals or businessmen or a combination of both will find ways to make these things work. The menthol cigarette part really confuses me. I remember reading some time back on the menthol side. Is that one of my questions from a menthol standpoint? Is that targeting the black community? The menthol, is that what I read? The reason for wanting to pull that?
The reason I want to pull it is that it's an attractive part of a product, which kills hundreds of thousands of people, it is true that there's clear evidence that the tobacco industry was targeting black communities when it came to the menthol component. That's not the total reason to want to have the rule. It's just generally we don't want people dying by the hundreds of thousands from tobacco products.
Well, just FYI, I used to smoke and they were cool cigarettes, so I guess I was ahead of my time. So, anyway, on this this black market, this illegals, my fear is when we cut this off and when we stop it and the flavoring, you're going to create a market. And of course, that market's going to come out of Mexico. It's going to just add more to what we're actually dealing with now with our fentanyl, with illegal marijuana, with cocaine, with all the other drugs that are coming across. You're just going to add another brick in the wall for these cartels. It gives them something else to add with. And I've made a living off of niche markets. I promise you, I understand when there's a niche market, there is huge profits to be made. And you're going to create a niche market here. My question is, does the FDA really think criminals will not step up into a multi-billion-dollar hole in this marketplace?
Well, I think one correction I'd like to make is I don't think our document said there would be no illegal market. The evidence is there will be not a large illegal market, and that's based on what's happened in Canada and several other countries that have already done this, and a very extensive analysis involving a lot of people. And I do think it's a critical issue that when this rule goes into effect, as I discussed with Representative Underwood, that we have a system to help people who need to get off of this terrible addiction of nicotine and related tobacco products. I'd also point out that there's nothing in our rule that prosecutes the user of the tobacco. It's only those that are selling it or manufacturing it who are at risk if they illegally market these products once the rule is finalized. So I'm very confident that there's not going to be a large illegal market, but there always in these kinds of things, there's some illegal market, and we'll have to deal with that.
So you got North Korea that finances most of their stuff from illegal cigarettes. That's a huge part of their income, North Korea, to give you some example. Has there been any studies, or does anyone know if there's already a tobacco cartel set up in Mexico?
I'm not aware of any study of tobacco cartels in Mexico.
Okay, so we in other words, we don't know if it exists or not. Fair enough. All right. Simple enough. Thank you, sir. Appreciate your time. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you, Ms. Mosser and Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, it's good to see you again, and I've had the pleasure of talking with you on a number of occasions, and I want to associate myself with the concerns that I've already made you aware of, that Ms. Underwood shared with you. I do also want to explore with you, going forward, how we address the concern that you raised with obviously a lot of addicted people who are not going to have access, right, for good reason, to an addictive product that will kill them. And so I would love to talk to you, following this hearing on how we can help make sure that we can fill in those gaps. Just a quick question. The gentleman from Alabama has just left, but I assume that there is an illegal market now. That's probably pretty big in the United States, right?
I'm sure there is because of the pricing issues. But, we've spent a lot of time studying this, and it was a major issue as the rule was being developed. And I think if you look at the documents, you'll see a very extensive discussion and references to studies that have been done that give us confidence.
So, cigarettes are expensive already. That usually generates a black market that might make them less expensive. That already exists in the United States. And the study that you did leading up to the banning of menthol flavoring suggested that there would not really be a significant increase, if any, in the existing black market.
That's correct. And again, I want to emphasize the key is not to target the individuals that are using the product
Right.
because they're addicted. The key is to deal with the criminals who are marketing illegally.
And then help the addicted get off their addiction and be able
That's
to.
what I'm most worried about now,
Yeah.
because I think we are going to succeed in getting this rule finalized.
Right, okay, thank you. I want to switch now to pediatric cancer. I was able to include report language in our bill last year concerning international collaboration for pediatric cancer, specifically encouraging FDA to work with international entities to promote greater collaboration around pediatric cancer drug development. You may not know I'm a breast cancer survivor myself, and any opportunity that we can take to make sure that we are able to combat cancer, make it more likely that we can find and develop drugs that will alleviate cancer is critical. So can you give us any insight into whether the FDA is engaging in this sort of international collaboration and provide specifics into that process?
Yes, thanks. Several things. First, starts with the Center of Excellence in Oncology, which you all were gracious enough to fund, which has really led the world in developing cancer drugs, and we're seeing it in the drop in cancer mortality in the U.S. in general. In the specific area of pediatrics, Dr. Pazder, the head of that center, and colleagues have added a few extra people thanks to the additional money that was allocated last year in a project I believe was called RACE, which to speed up oncology drug development in children. And what's being done internationally, which is really groundbreaking, is the Center of Excellence in Oncology holds conference calls now with international regulators in this area to discuss the development of cancer drugs in children. It's part of a bigger effort that involves international regulators in oncology in general, and that's going along quite well. One thing I do want to call to your attention, because it relates to other things we've been discussing, there are cancer drugs, along with all the other shortages, we're concerned about the risk to shortage of cancer drugs, not for the new drugs, but for the old drugs that work, where there may be only one supplier, for example, in industry. So we're going to have to watch the other side of that equation also.
In that same vein, are there any regulatory burdens concerning drug development and bringing products to the U.S. market that we need to be aware of, especially in light of the shortage you just mentioned?
This is an area that's in our budget ask. People frequently assume that we have a lot of detailed data at the FDA about supply chains. We don't. And in fact, we've not been successful for the most part in convincing Congress that we need access to that data, because a lot of it's considered a trade secret by the industry. I think if you look at our ability to handle confidential information in the FDA, it's been pretty darn good. Some would say too good in terms of the degree to which we protect confidential information. And so I think to deal with all these things, we really need to have more access to the information. Each company is now digitizing its own supply chain, but if you intersect the various companies, there is no central hub. And so I also don't want to imply that the FDA can deal with this alone. I think when it comes to the shortages issue, whether it's children's drugs for oncology or drugs for diabetes or food commodities, it's more of an all-of-government issue.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it would be wonderful if we could endeavor, as you prepare the chair's mark, to address some of these issues. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Califf, for being here. Thank you for all the FDA does. We appreciate all of your efforts, and as you mentioned in your testimony, we have the safest food supply in the world, and we owe a debt of gratitude to your agency for working with partners in the food industry to make that happen. But against the backdrop of also some of your testimony of the supply chain challenges that we're facing, food shortages, also the extremely high cost of food we're dealing with now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the food traceability rule that your agency released last fall. 596 pages, very broad ruling. Just the definition of high-risk foods itself is over 100 pages. And my understanding is that the specific food items that will be identified as high risk, that hasn't been made yet, but could number in the tens of thousands. My concern is there's always this fine balance of trying to do the right thing, but then also not having unintended consequences. The feedback I'm getting from grocers, large and small, is that it's, while possible to implement this, for the larger grocers, they can do it. It's going to be staggeringly expensive. It's going to cost a tremendous amount of labor that they don't really have right now, but they'll figure it out. But ultimately, they'll be able to pass those costs along at a time when folks are really struggling to put food on the table to begin with. But on the other end of that spectrum, the smaller grocers, and that's where I'm really concerned, there's a lot of worry that this ruling could actually put them out of business. And I represent a district that's largely rural, a lot of areas that have food deserts where they're lucky to have a single grocery store in the town, and they're not the large national chains that people are aware of. There's a concern that we may drive food out of our districts altogether if this rule is implemented. Can you help allay my concerns there? And then as we look to roll this out, is there going to be a mechanism to look at and go, okay, if we're getting unintended consequences here, are we going to be willing to look at this and explore it? Because some of the feedback I've also gotten is during the remarks period, there was a lot of feedback discussing these concerns that seems to have fallen on deaf ears. So I'd love to get your take on all that.
Well, let me first of all say, I'm from South Carolina. I think I have a feeling for rural America, although I grew up in the big city of Columbia, which, but surrounded by relatives that lived in rural areas. And we're also seeing this decline in life expectancy in our rural areas. It's very troublesome. And if there's no industry or business in those areas, it's going to continue to decline. So I'm very sensitive, and I think the whole FDA is. I think all of the questions, many of the questions you all have asked today bring up this balance issue of we need to move to the future, but if we move too fast, we particularly punish the small business component of any industry that we regulate. I'll just say we're very sensitive to it. We have seen the comments. We're going to do everything we can to accommodate and help small business achieve this point. And being a bit of a techie, having worked at Alphabet as part of my career, I'll just say that the digital world doesn't have to disadvantage small businesses. In fact, if you look at cloud technology, it doesn't matter if you got one person or 1,000 people. You should be able to hook into it if we get the systems right. And so we're going to have to do this one step at a time. As I said, educate before you regulate. Also be sensitive that if we're disadvantaging small business, particularly rural business, too much right now, we'll be very attuned to that and make course corrections. Sometimes it means you need to take a little more time than you expected, or to put additional educational programs together that help people come along and survive in a tough business environment.
So do I understand correctly, there's a 2-year implementation period for this rule now?
I don't have it on the top of my head, but it's something like that.
Okay. So I would hope then if we get into this, and particularly in the trying times that we're in now, that may be an overly aggressive timeline to try to comply.
We'll be very sensitive to that. As I said, I've been an inspectee and been on the other side of the fence, and almost everyone that gets regulated would like a little more time, but sometimes it's really the right thing to do, and we'll be very attuned to that.
Very good. All right, thank you. Now yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Molinar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to have you with us, Dr. Califf. At our hearing last year, I shared several of the hundreds of stories I received from constituents who were impacted by the FDA's failure to ensure a safe supply of infant formula. In your testimony, I read that the agency is using the lessons learned in regard to COVID-19 to continue our core mission that the agency has remained laser-focused on a variety of critical efforts, including stabilizing the supply chain for critical products such as infant formula. You framed the new approach as the FDA Human Foods Program as transformative, forward-thinking, proactive, and adaptive. These adjectives sound great, but I was frustrated yesterday after reading a Politico article entitled "Lessons Have Not Been Learned," and that the FDA knew of positive tests before the latest infant formula recall. The article says, and I understand you're familiar with the article, that FDA inspectors had become aware of the positive tests that ultimately sparked this recall in November, an FDA spokesman confirmed to Politico. It goes on to say that one of the biggest unanswered questions remaining from the formula crisis of last year is why FDA inspectors had missed major food safety problems at Sturgis and that the agency has not provided a full explanation for why these why these issues were not found during a routine inspection 5 months prior to the recall. The FDA also did not heed a detailed warning from a whistleblower about the plant, a revelation that was first reported by Politico. Is there anything you can clarify for us on that?
Well, first of all, if you find a Politico article that says lessons were learned, please let me know, because the headlines in Politico very rarely are positive, I would say. In terms of clarification, I feel like we have put out a pretty clear set of reports about what happened there, why inspectors didn't pick up something that was observed 5 months later. You know, we have the inspection reports, we have what they saw. Things were different 5 months later.
Okay.
Maybe if something had been done more, in a more attuned way, it would have been picked up earlier. And
Okay, well,
I can go
also-
through each of these like that, but we're also glad to get back with you with those
Well, I
details.
think, yeah, timing-wise, it would be helpful. And yesterday, former Deputy Commissioner for Food Policy, Frank Yanis, testified that there was internal debate at the agency on whether there was really a role for the FDA in monitoring food supply chains, and how FDA's siloed organizational structure and culture impeded rapid, critical problem identification, communication, and response. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would separate those into two different categories. The issue on supply chains we just went over, related to just about everything we do. I don't think there's any debate that we should be monitoring, but the degree to which we can monitor with the resources we have relative to all the other, like Department of Agriculture and other involved departments, is something that we need to work out. That was definitely debated. On the siloed nature, definitely a problem, and it's a key part of what we're doing to fix the problems that we saw. When I came in a year ago, the issue of siloed thinking was obvious. All of our constituents have brought it up, and people inside the FDA. We're working on it. I'm a basketball guy. I believe in teams. Teams that do well communicate better. And that's a problem that needs to be fixed. I agree with it.
Okay. I want to change course a bit and talk about milk. You have a proposed rule addressing that issue. You know, I have constituents who are dairy producers, who are concerned about the identity of milk is being blurred, and wondering what the FDA plans to do on that.
Well, it's pretty well known. I'm an avid milk drinker and an ice cream eater. I have to, although I am a cardiologist, I think some of the stuff has been clarified about nutritional value, et cetera. What we've established in the research that was done is that Americans don't have trouble distinguishing between cow's milk and almond milk. They know that there's a difference in where it comes from. Where there is confusion is on the nutritional value of those two different commodities. And so our rule is really focused on explicitly stating where there are differences in nutritional value, as opposed to focusing on the name for one compared to the other. Because when these issues of naming have been brought up in court consistently now, the First Amendment wins out, that people have the right to call it what they will. I thought about bringing a prop that had like an almond and a cow. People know the difference. So, but where they're confused is, one has a different set of nutritional value than the other, and we need to make sure that people understand that.
Okay, thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Kaptur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I apologize. We have concurrent hearings going on. And Dr. Califf, thank you for joining us and for all the work you do to protect American consumers. Each of us comes from a little different perspective. Mine is what America makes and grows America. I'm very much of a domestic production person. And so my questions to you have to do with, first of all, food and then drugs. On the food side, when I go to the supermarket now and I pick up purple plums and they're canned, and I took them home, and I served them, and then I put the extras in the refrigerator. Within 4 days, they got mold on the top. And then I looked at the can, and on the back of the can, it said, "Product from China." I thought, oh, does China grow plums? I learned something if they do. But I was troubled by that. And it's a very well-known supermarket whose name I will not mention at the hearing. On pharmaceuticals, I am very concerned about our supply chain domestically, and served in Congress long enough to have gone through the situation where FDA took 4 years to figure out that heparin was tainted purposefully in China, and that stuff got in here, and there's a book called RX China, which I recommend to everyone who cares about this subject. It took me 2 elections to get to the truth on that. And so I'm concerned about food quality and medicine quality and what we can do better as a country regarding this. If you can't answer my question here today, here's what they are. What steps are you taking to ensure product labeling in the case of medicines and food for the American people? And how is the FDA working to track country of origin data and establish a national database for this information? One of the main ingredients of heparin is the mucus of pig intestines. We have a lot of that here in this country, and we should be making our own medicine, in my opinion. Additionally, how are you working with BARTA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, to address public health vulnerabilities? And would budget cuts that may be proposed, we'll see what those in leadership on the Republican side do present us, how would those budget cuts prevent you from furthering your critical work? Thank you.
Well, those are great questions. I know we have limited time. As we've discussed already with this group, I share your concerns about offshoring of American technology and also American food. I do want to reassure you that everything coming in that's imported is held to the same standard as American standards, and there's an extensive cascaded system that starts with digital evaluation and ultimately inspection as things come into port. But there's no question it's more complicated if it's coming from other parts, and we have a lot of work to do as long as the marketplace is working the way it is, to do as much as we can to help other countries achieve the standards that are necessary. I also want to call your attention to something that I think is a really, really serious and growing problem. You mentioned heparin, which is a generic drug. We have multiple generic drug manufacturers in the U.S. who are going out of business because it's the same old story. By the time they paid the personnel costs that are standard for America, they lose money when they produce the drug. We just had a major one that went out of business, and it's causing a number of problems. So the cost is lower in other countries, and that's created a marketplace which is defeating the purpose that I know that you have. So FDA can't necessarily fix that problem. We can call attention to it, but we all need to work together to figure out what to do to make American businesses more competitive in this arena.
Well, if you look at the trends in fruits and vegetables and in medicines, I am very worried about our supply chain. And it was clear during the pandemic what happened. Our local community didn't even have ventilators that fit the wall because they were brought in from other countries. So I would just say, Mr. Chairman, there's not time now, but I would just urge us to put constructive language in the final bill this year in order to get more attention to the economics of producing in this country again. And we ought to do it.
I can tell you from FDA perspective, we would welcome it. It's just the point I want to make again is that we have our role to play and we don't want to shirk it. We want to be held accountable for our role, but there's a much larger domestic policy issue about what we do about our supply chain.
Mr. Valadao.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, for your time today. And I know it's been addressed a little bit. I know Mr. Molinar brought it up, and I'm sure a few others have brought it up as well. But on the baby formula issue, I need to go in a little more on that. In your testimony, you make the claim that our food supply is the safest it has ever been. While this has been the case historically, the American public is still struggling to fully be convinced. Just this last February, formula giant Reckitt recalled about 145,000 cans, plant-based infant formula over the possible cross-contamination with the same deadly pathogen that sparked the 2022 formula crisis. This recall came months after initial failed tests in September when the batch was destroyed, but has later been determined by the agency to not have been properly contained. Consequently, 2 later batches of the formula hit the store shelves and were ultimately recalled on February 20th of this year. Obviously, there's no single entity to blame for the recent failure to maintain a stable national supply of infant formula, but I'm curious. Have you or any one of your staff who directly reports to you ever personally visited one of these manufacturers, been to their facilities where these outbreaks have happened?
Number of our people have been. I've been on the phone with all the executives of every company, sometimes once a week during the peak of the crisis, but we're well aware of the conditions in these factories.
So when we have an issue at home, and sometimes I can't be there myself, like right now, we've got this flooding issue in California. I've got my guys out there, I'm talking to my guys directly from my office, the people who report directly to me. So when you say your guys, I know you've got a big department under you. How far down the food chain are these people who are actually going to those facilities?
What's happened is we have now a weekly call, but it used to be a daily call, including weekends, that had the leadership and then the next level down, which is the very next level that deals with infant formula, very much hands-on, including talking with people who are in the facilities. And remember that in the case of Abbott, we have a consent decree, so by law, we're co-managing that effort. So essentially, during the peak of this, we were there every single day. So I think the communication is very tight, day to day, week to week. It's a little more week to week now because, as you know, the percent in stock is now what it was before the recall. We still have some distribution problems, particularly to rural areas, that we're concerned about.
But you yourself haven't had the opportunity to be at one of these facilities or someone that reports directly to you personally?
Oh, people that report directly to me, yes, have been in those facilities. But, you know, I was advised, particularly in the case of Sturgis, not to go for a variety of reasons. And
What type of advice would that be?
we don't want to, when a place is in crisis and working on fixing it, you don't want to disturb the facility by having people distracted from their day-to-day work. We had people there, and the advice I had was to let them do their work.
All right. FDA just recently received a net increase of $226 million in the 2023 omnibus. Can you please explain how the requested $64 million increase on top of that $226 million to modernize oversight of the infant formula would be worthwhile investment for the American taxpayer in wake of the continued recalls?
All right, well, if you look back at last year, we had, in terms of evaluating infant formula, people applying to put infant formula on the market, it was a total of 13 or 14 people. We had a variety of the inspectorate and also many other people that were brought in who were assigned to other areas, but were brought in because of the crisis and worked on the issue. What we envision for the future is a dedicated inspectorate of about 10 people, a leader for that inspectorate, and then a number of people who are dealing with the applications as they come in a much more rapid fashion. We've already heard today that people would like us to evaluate applications more speedily. It's not a trivial matter because there are over 30 constituents of any batch of formula that have to be there in the right amount. We've had people that have applied that couldn't cut it, who have had to be turned down because they were not up to the grade that's needed for successful infant formula. So I think this would be a big payoff. We have millions of infants who are dependent on this formula.
And I know I'm running a little bit tight on time, but the number is $60-some million increase on top of the 226. And when you talked about teams, we were talking in the tens of numbers.
I don't think the $60 million is for infant formula, increases for infant
That's
formula
overall.
alone, so we'll get back to you on that. I think you'll find it's very tightly accounted for, but if we have misinformation about that, I definitely want to get it straightened out.
All right, well, I appreciate the time, and I yield back.
Ms. Letlow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Thank you, Commissioner, for being here with us today. Earlier this year, the FDA finalized a rule that would broaden the availability of abortion pills to many more pharmacies, including large chains and mail-order companies. This rule came after the Biden administration partially implemented the change last year, announcing it would no longer enforce a long-standing requirement for abortion medication to be picked up by the patient in person. Dr. Califf, are there potential dangers to women from telehealth-ordered abortions?
I appreciate your interest in the question, but this is a matter that's under litigation, so I can't comment on it.
Wow, okay. All right. I will move on then. It's my understanding the FDA has completed its second pre-market consultation for a human food made from cultured animal cells. And this is the second action completed under the formal agreement between the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Food and Drug Administration, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture Office of Food Safety, announced on March 7th, 2019. I'm interested in the internal FDA protocols related to pre-market consultations for cell-cultured protein products, and specifically whether there are special or unique considerations made for these products in pre-market consultation processes under the formal agreement. What are the agency's plans to coordinate with its counterparts on the Department of Agriculture on further action regarding the same products?
Well, this is a very complicated area, as you well know,
Sure.
and appreciate your interest in it, because as we look at climate change and supply chain disruptions, the use of biotechnology in food is a huge area that we're all interested in. There's no getting around it. It requires collaboration with the Department of Agriculture, for example, because we have split responsibilities here. The technology of cell culture is something we have a lot of expertise in the FDA, because it cuts across everything we do, from animals to plants to creating treatments for sick children, for example. And so what we do is apply our expertise to the issues involved in whether the data coming from the cell cultures is the quality of the product is looked at, the safety of the product, the potential impact on humans. That's our expertise, and that's what our protocols are oriented towards. We expect to see a lot more applications in this arena, and so, we'll all learn as we go along, but I think we have good protocols at this point.
Okay. The FDA has been working on the Closer to Zero initiative related to reducing exposure to certain heavy metals in infant foods. The FDA has stated previously that this work will be science-based and that the agency will develop action levels that are both feasible and achievable. We know that many farm organizations are working with FDA to evaluate actions that can be taken to further reduce heavy metals, but there is no perfect solution. The FDA's fiscal year 2024 budget proposal requests continued support for the Closer to Zero plan to expeditiously develop action levels and provide guidance on best practices for reducing and eliminating toxic elements in infant and toddler foods. Will you please elaborate further and provide details on the schedule and plans for specific metals in the Closer to Zero initiative? And will the FDA continue to base decisions on science-based risk assessments and adopt action levels only to the extent that are both feasible and achievable?
You've actually done a beautiful job of describing what the issue is. I have to say that was very
Thank you. It's
well
a team
done.
effort.
It relates to a lot of what we talked about in this meeting, and that there's a balance. I think we'd all like heavy metals to be at zero for our infants, but we know we can't get there. For example, there's several of them are in water or in the ground. We're not going to be able to get rid of those, and so we are always having to balance what's feasible with what the ideal is, and that's why it's called Closer to Zero. And I think, as I say, you depicted it quite well. We have targets for dates that we want to reach. We're making public our dates for when we put our determinations into interagency review. But when we do that, the Department of Agriculture that you brought up is another major player here. They have knowledge and understanding of issues where their input is important, for example. That process can take some time, but it's very much our goal to balance, to come as close to zero as we can, but not at a level which, for example, makes the commodity unavailable to the public. And that's a real risk with some of these, that an idealistic view would actually make it impossible to have an industry that produces a product.
Thank you for your time. I yield back.
Thank you very much, and if Ms. Ledlow, if you'd like to stay, there will be another round of questions, and not a long wait. Well, thank you very much. Again, thanks, Dr. Califf, for being here. You've got your work cut out for you at the FDA, no doubt about it. Let me just ask about something about import testing, because I believe the scheme we had for when we were taking formula in the emergency is we were going to test that formula here in the United States. Is that right?
Yeah, there's a lot of testing that goes on to these.
But here, I
commodities.
mean, we were not going to, it was not tested in the facility where it was made, but it was imported here and tested. Now,
I'd have to get back to you exactly on when the testing is done. I don't have it on the top
thought
of
we
my
had
head.
done that. I thought that's how we got around this, some of the safety issue, during late
One
in
comment, I know we're in overtime, so maybe I can just comment. We already had foreign plants. It's just part of the regular scheme, just like we do with other commodities that were regularly being inspected, just like our American plants. Like Abbott is an international company and has a plant in Ireland, for example. And so it's the reason I don't want to say something that's not right at this point.
I've got you. But we could, I mean, if we were worried about imported drugs and we don't have the ability, because you said because of multiple reasons why why the inspection schedule in the other country, on-site inspection schedule, might not really work to assure the safety and purity. Why wouldn't we, as Congress, authorize a scheme where every imported drug actually has to be batch tested by an independent FDA-approved lab? So in other words, we wait for the drug to come in, we test that batch, you're a bad player, you're producing a drug that is not safe and efficacious or the purity that you want, sorry, you can't import into the United States anymore. I mean, in other words, to get the bad players out. I know that scheme doesn't exist, but theoretically, could that solve the problem or begin to?
Theoretically, it could. We'd have to get back to you, but with our CEDAR colleagues, but from everything I know, that would be one approach. What I would point out would happen, first of all, I'm not at all worried about the innovator side of the industry. It's doing pretty well with its supply chains, and there's a lot of money to be made there once you get it to the point you're on the market. It's really the generic industry, over 90% of the prescriptions, where such a maneuver would increase the cost a bit. And it's really, the competition in the generic industry is almost entirely on the basis of cost right now, and it concerns us a lot at the FDA. We need a hard look at that industry to make sure that quality is built in, which is going to cost a little bit more.
So we're told, though, that some of the hospital systems actually, because of their concern about the purity of some of the generic imported products, actually have established their own system of testing, that before they release it into their distribution system in a hospital system, but we could consider that model nationwide. Anyway, two other very brief things. One, just bring to your attention that there's an issue with non-human primates being allowed to be brought into the country from Cambodia, and obviously FDA for some studies requires non-human primate testing. So just so you're aware of the issue, and hopefully work with State Department and make sure that we don't become dependent on China for non-human primates as well. Just very briefly, I'm a little disturbed that CMS, with regards to Aduhelm, kind of countered the safe and effective determination of the FDA. And as far as I'm concerned, FDA is where you make the safe and effective decision. That's not up to CMS. They don't have the expertise. So I'm disappointed with them, and I will bring that up. Again, not your problem. It's the problem over at CMS, I perceive. Now, one last issue, and this is a serious issue. This is something that actually isn't being litigated, so you should be able to answer this. Ivermectin. And I asked you this about the tweet, the famous ivermectin tweet out of FDA. You all not a horse or whatever it was. I don't remember what it was, which I felt was totally inappropriate because ivermectin, as you know, incredible safety record, hundreds of millions of doses in humans. Now, it looks like it may not be effective for COVID, but physicians were prescribing it off-label. It's a very safe drug, and yet the FDA appears, and it's still on the website, why you shouldn't use ivermectin for COVID-19. Okay, it's still on the website. Let's contrast that with Lupron. You're aware, you know what Lupron is, I assume, right? A puberty blocker, treats prostatic cancer. But the fastest growing use of it right now is to treat gender dysphoria in teenage girls. Now, as you're aware, that's completely off-label use, completely off-label use, and I'll just read you the headline from the Stat article, and I'm sure you're familiar with the publication Stat from 2017, and it hasn't changed. Quote, drug use to halt puberty in children may cause lasting health problems. And as you know, there have been 27,000 adverse events reported to FDA with it, 12,000 considered serious, 2,000 deaths. Is FDA going to tweet about that or put that on the website, in fact, urging people not to use Lupron for gender dysphoria, given that it's an off-label use and there's evidence it's far more dangerous than ivermectin, which obviously someone at the FDA felt they should begin to interfere with off-label prescribing. Does the FDA have plans to do the same for Lupron?
Well, first of all, with regard to ivermectin, I mean, I know that you're an expert doctor. If there is no benefit, then any risk.
All right, let me proceed right from there. Is there a proven long-term benefit from the use of Lupron to treat gender dysphoria in teenage girls?
I'm not an expert in that arena. I'd have to go back and look at it.
You just told me, well, are you the expert in ivermectin? Because you just declared ivermectin as not effective, so you have
Actually,
not
no,
looked at Lupron, I guess. Is that right?
Well, I'm very familiar with the clinical trials on ivermectin.
And I'm
because
I'm familiar with the adverse event outcomes from Lupron and the lack of clinical trials showing long-term effectiveness. So I would urge the FDA to go back and instead of playing favorites, I would say political favorites with off-label uses. The FDA should be much more serious if they want to be treated as a serious organization.
I appreciate your concern.
I'm going to ask one last question. Does the person who tweeted that about ivermectin still work at the FDA? You can get back to me on that.
Yeah.
That person should have been fired. That person simply should have been fired. What percent of approved drugs in the United States, what percent of prescriptions are for off-label uses for prescription drugs?
It's a high percentage.
It's pretty high. It's like 40%, right? So someone at the FDA decided to play politics with ivermectin, chooses not to play politics with Lupron, which is a far more dangerous drug. I would like you to get back to me whether that person still has a job at the FDA. In closing, I really appreciate the job you have. It's a wide-ranging job. It's a thankless job. I'm surprised none of my colleagues have commented on it, but your answers must have satisfied them completely. I thank you for being here. Obviously, your agency has a very important role in maintaining the safety and efficacy and purity of drugs, safety of our food chain, and we will take that into account as we make our budget determinations. I want to remind the members who aren't here that they can still enter questions into the record for 7 days. And I adjourn the
All right, thank you.
hearing.